It's been around a week, almost 6 days now, since I lodged my complaint to the International Criminal Court. I've sort of taken a breather, just caught up with a few things, and I've decided to also now start a bit of a kind of a regular update on YouTube, which I'll upload on the website or the YouTube channel of Swarn Bharat Party, that is the Liberal Party of India that I had helped to start. Because what I'm saying is relevant not just for Victoria and Australia, but all over the world, and particularly also for India, where we've seen the similar kind of problems with lockdowns. So in this particular short update, I want to summarize the key arguments in my ICC complaint. But before that, I want to give an update on where I have evolved since I resigned, where I moved, and why did I have to go to the International Criminal Court. As you know, that when I resigned, I was working in the Treasury, so I had very little time to spare on studying this issue. So it was very obvious to me that from the policy angle, this was completely disproportionate, and also it was not based on the actual risk or its distribution. And that's what I wrote in my Fin Review article on the 16th of September after resignation. Thereafter, when I wrote the book, I was able to do a lot more research. I spent about 10 days on that book, and a lot of people sent me very valuable information, and I thank you very much for that. One of the key things I discovered was that we had actually got a proper pandemic plan in Victoria, and this is also similar to plans of that sort all over the world. I also discovered that many international covenants had been breached in this process. And so I wrote about the emergency declaration and the precautionary principle and many other things in my book, which are all absolutely relevant, and also discussed a bit of the science behind pandemics and viruses. So I encourage you to have a look at that. But really what happened since then is that it became very clear to me that this was not just a breach of the laws in Victoria. It was a massive breach of laws that had taken place across the whole of the country in Australia. And in Australia, particularly, the Prime Minister was personally involved because he was trying to eradicate the virus in Australia. And that's prohibited by the Biosecurity Act. So he was doing something he's prohibited from doing, but obviously it's very popular. And being popular is a good thing, I suppose, for politicians. And they wouldn't care a damn about the laws, as we know very well, in Victoria and also all over the world. So now that led to this ICC complaint. And while doing the research on the ICC complaint, the International Criminal Court complaint, on which I spent 20 days, and that's a lot of time. And when I was working, I was spending around 14 hours a day on this matter. And that's absolutely probably the minimum that I was spending. I was barely sleeping, and I've managed to catch up sleep in the last few days, but I was hardly sleeping for nearly 20 days. And in the process, I discovered that the only time, and the most important discovery, I want to start off with that first, because that frames the whole thing, is that the only time in the last 100 years or even 500 years that we've used lockdowns, anywhere resembling, even closely resembling what we've done this time across the world, the only time was for Ebola. And we did that in the, I think, late 1990s, initially in one or two African countries, and then it was done in 2014 in Africa once again. Now, you would assume that if a thing like Ebola is out there as a very frighteningly deadly disease, that the scientists would be all out there trying to figure out what's happened. And yes, there was an evaluation conducted of the Ebola lockdowns, and it said clearly that only the community-wide targeted, the smaller targeted quarantines were successful in limiting the spread of Ebola. But large-scale community-wide lockdowns were completely ineffective. And apart from that, they caused absolute havoc in Africa. And I think they caused so much harm, and that's the kind of concern about the ethics of these lockdowns that was there in the literature of the public health. So now you would imagine that allegedly people, who claim to be following science, that they would be aware of this basic fact that lockdowns have not only been rejected for flu-like pandemics repeatedly. There's a lot of literature that I discovered, and I've also outlined in my book, but also in the ICC complaint in detail, that it was rejected. It was considered and rejected as being totally unsuitable. And there are good reasons for that, and the reasons were provided in great detail in my ICC complaint. But you can look at the kind of enormous literature that exists around the suitability of this idea, and that has been rejected. And there's not a single plan in the world, the single pandemic plan, that ever refers to a lockdown as a requirement for dealing with a flu-like pandemic. And the important thing there is that for Ebola as well, you'd imagine that a thing that's not even proved successful for Ebola would be well known to all the so-called scientists of the world. I think the scientists have lost so much credibility. I just can't imagine what's going on in the world today. Virtually every second scientist that you pick up has become a politician. I mean, this is something that everybody should have known. If they're dealing with this issue of pandemic planning, a chief health officer, for example, he should have known that lockdowns are actually the most harmful thing in the world. They do not even directly or indirectly deal with the problem, but they cause a lot of harm. And they're absolutely unsuitable for flu-like viruses. There may be a light, small consideration given to a little bit of a broader targeting, maybe a small, bunch of homes taken together. Maybe. I'm not saying this should be done. But very targeted, risk-based. It might still be appropriate in the case of Ebola. And that's the evaluation that needs to be done, and I think it's happening. But for the case of flu, how in heaven's name did these alleged scientists even remotely hit upon this idea of a lockdown? And that's the kind of thing that I discovered. That's probably the biggest thing I discovered during my studies for the ICC complaint. I think that that's something so frighteningly obvious to anybody when you think about it, that anyone listening to me should pause for a minute that, hey, if it doesn't work for Ebola, why in heaven's name are we doing this for a flu-like virus? Okay? Have a think about this. And if you think about this, you sort of start asking the second question. All right, so how, if these are not even part of any pandemic plan, they are completely unlawful from all angles, from the ethical angle, from the legal angle, and everything else, why are we doing this all over the world? So I think as you start thinking about this, that's the kind of framing that I've put for my ICC complaint. Ebola, the lockdowns being completely rejected in all the science, in all the laws. There's not a single pandemic plan in the world. And by the way, I've cited the European one, the American one, and of course the Australian ones. And there are people like Martin Kulldorff, the professor of Harvard University, who has been a great supporter of my work, by the way, I should add, for the last 6 months. He has actually said that all over Europe, the pandemic plans were all in place and not a single one of them was talking about lockdowns. And so we've seen this amazing situation where allegedly in the name of doing science, the scientists have completely and comprehensively violated the science. And they've done things in a manner that's also breached all the international laws. The international laws are designed with great care to protect basic human rights all over the world. And therefore, the idea that a public health intervention can be imposed in this manner is simply not practical, because you have to go through the legal process of analysis. There's a lot of legal stuff. There's a lot of human rights and ethical issues that you need to consider. But what have these guys done? These alleged scientists, they have used so-called models. For them, that has become science. And that's the second part. I think I've got, let's say that's another part of the thing which I've explained in my book as well at great length. But really, they've started telling us that their models are science. I've got a PhD in economics, not from a trivial university. It's a University of Southern California in Los Angeles. I've studied all these models. Not I'm saying all the models, but I've studied how models are made in the field of economics, for instance. And with models, you can actually plug in, you can create any model to suit your personal preference. Unless you're very diligently focused on ensuring that every single part of your model is verified with reality, you can very quickly go off track. And the epidemiological models, I actually commissioned a group of people, a voluntary group of people, brought them together in the month of March. And for a month or so, they did some work, and then they came out saying that these models, epidemiological models, are methodologically fraught. They basically cannot work. And I've written about this in my Times of India articles in great length about the mythical thing called R0. I won't go into details here, but I want to simply emphasize that models are not science. Models are mathematics. Mathematics is never, never, never science. I've got a background in science. I've got a genuine background with physics and chemistry and mathematics. I was a national science standard scholar in India. I studied biology extensively for that. And I can only assure you that even in physics, it is not the maths that is the science. It is the empirical validation of your hypothesis that is the science. So the idea that a model can be proposed as a basis to the courts for arguing that this was such a frighteningly bad pandemic that we had to use this massive lockdown, otherwise we would all be lost. That is the biggest pile of whatever, what we should call it. You know that. It's the biggest pile of that. How can anybody call a model a science, a scientific process? Science is all about the reality, and that's about the hospitalizations, the people who present themselves, the shortfall in the ICU capacity, if any. The reality, we are looking at the reality constantly, and that is called science. But when you start saying that there will be 95,000 people dead in Sweden, that's what these stupid people like Neil Ferguson's models were trying to predict. And they predicted 500,000 people dead in England, 95,000 dead in Sweden, if they didn't have the lockdowns. Anders Tegnell, as you're aware, I keep advocating for a Nobel Prize for him, both for medicine and for peace. Anders Tegnell said, sorry, Mr. Ferguson, you do not know any science. You may have some mathematical skills, but they are bunkum. He basically didn't say that bluntly, but he said that we have considered all these things and rejected them outright. Johann Giesecke, who was the predecessor of Anders Tegnell, was even more blunt. And there are many other people who are far more blunt and say that this guy, Ferguson, has no credibility among any of the scientists. This is the kind of guy they were listening to all over the world, remember. The guy who's got no credibility. If you go back in the history of Neil Ferguson's modeling exploits, he has been over-predicting in the past on a massive scale of tens or hundreds of times larger than the actual thing, including the mad cow disease and I'm told even swine flu, but I haven't verified that. But I know that there were swine flu excesses and modelers, who projected, I don't know, millions of lives lost from swine flu, which of course nothing of that sort happened. Okay, so the second part that I've not yet fully analyzed, I put it at great length in my complaint, is about the models. That models are not science. Science is all about hypothesis, reality checking, like lockdowns, do they work or not work? What works? Hand washing works. Do masks work? No, they don't work. Okay, and all that stuff, that's called science. And we have sufficient proof of what works and what doesn't. And that's what Anders Tegnell followed. Anders Tegnell, by the way, did not follow anything exceptional. All he did was to follow what is in the pandemic plan of all the countries of the world. He did not go outside the standard science. But all these characters that you're seeing around you all over the world, hysterical, absolutely hysterical, absolutely gone berserk. These people are claiming to use the science, but they're not using any science. They're just using their gut feeling, their panic. They've become irrational. They're using what I call the limbic brain. Do you know the limbic brain is different from the frontal lobe, which is limbic brain is right behind us, the lizard brain, which is our reptilian brain, which is only knows fear. It only knows emotions. These characters are using emotions. They've lost their sense completely. They threw out their brain the moment the pandemic started. It started with China, of course, and I won't go into details. I'm studying that separately, but that was not part of my ICC complaint. The complaint was that these guys have not followed the basic science. The complaint was that they are following the so-called models. And the third part of my complaint is that we are very fortunate. The world has been extraordinarily fortunate. It is blessed, I would say, because of certain factors which happened maybe 100 or 200 years ago in Sweden, where the emergency could not be declared and politicians could not therefore call this an emergency. And you know very well what I've said repeatedly, that pandemics cannot be an emergency of any sort. Pandemics can be a little bit of a crisis when it happens, but they're not an emergency where you stop doing things that you have to do the normal way, because you have planned for the pandemics. They're well known. They come very regularly at every 30-year interval. There's a pretty large pandemic, and of course this one has not even become anywhere close to the pandemics of Asian flu and Hong Kong flu, which I keep emphasizing. But I'm not going to do that right now in this short conversation, which I'll just allude at towards the end. These issues of data, the issues of the death count being grossly exaggerated, the issue of testing and all that stuff. I'll come to that in a minute. But really the third basic point in my complaint, as you go through it, is the beautiful case study or the control experiment we have, the control. All these guys have gone mad. All these guys have gone hysterical. They're all breaking the law. They're all trampling human rights. And yet you have one fine gentleman who's running a system the way it should be run, which is very gently, politely, nicely explaining to the people of Sweden the facts, showing them that this is a bad situation, but that it's perfectly manageable. If they do the following things, he gives them recommendations. He looks at the privately managed health aged care centers and tells them to take care. They did not. So he got more involved in that. That was a mistake of the private healthcare centers, not his, because he had given them proper guidance on how to deal with this and how to protect the elderly, which they did not initially. But at no point did he ever remotely imagine going outside the scope of the standard human rights based, well considered, ethical, mainly voluntary recommendations to the people of Sweden. And there was massive support. I think right through the whole thing, he's received well over 70 to 80% support from the people of Sweden. And they were very blessed. They were very lucky to have a person like him who just followed the thing like a mechanical robot, just implementing, yes, hand washing and social distancing and blah, blah, blah. And all voluntary. No masks, please. It's not required. They don't work. In fact, they can harm. All this is what he said. I've heard his conversations on YouTube, and some of them are found on this channel that I've posted earlier. Lots and lots of videos from Anders Tegnell. You'll find on this channel. I've been paying a lot of attention to him. We were very lucky to have him. And so Sweden is the beautiful test case where there was no extra deaths caused by lockdowns. So lockdowns, I have argued in my ICC complaint, are absolutely deadly. That's the only word for that. They have caused terror. They have tortured the minds of millions of people. And they've caused carnage in terms of shortening the lives of what I argue in the ICC complaint. At least a few 100 million people's lives have been shortened by these lockdowns. Now, here is the interesting thing. Nobody can ever easily know whether their personal life was shortened. I have argued that my life has also been shortened. My body cannot recover from the complete damage done to it by the lockdowns. 7 months of lockdowns, I could not get the regular exercise, no tennis. I just hated the idea of going outside because the mask mandate. And only now I've sort of slightly a little bit. I'm trying to go out a bit more But I've never recovered to the levels of exercise that I used to undertake prior to this lockdown system. Whether my life is shortened or not, we will never know. And individually, it can never be known. But statistically, I would argue that it can be known. And we will get to know pretty soon. In fact, there's sufficient data coming out, which I've cited, I think about 10 to 15 pages of information about reports coming about people presenting with very advanced cancers, people dying at home with heart attacks, which they never got to go to the hospital in time because they were afraid. They never got themselves checked for various things, which led to then strokes or whatever. So we've seen a spurt of cancers that could have been avoided or pushed back. People will live only 3 to 5 years now. Many of the people who would actually have lived 20, 25 years had they done the proper thing with going to the hospital in time, but they were terrorized. Even till today, as I speak, messages of terror are being issued on a daily basis by the governments in Australia and all over the world. All kinds of things, that this virus has mutated into some kind of a weird shape and form, that we've got this long COVID, that the cases are rising. Everybody's got so many excuses to be hysterical. No one's looking at the data because the cases are all, they simply don't matter. What matters is the actual deaths. And we look at the actual deaths, they're virtually very few, particularly once you have achieved a certain level of immunity, which is like in Sweden, you're almost seeing very small increase in deaths now, which is much less than the normal flu. And a good example of what's happening in terms of the magnitude, I want to just refer to that right now, because I've referred to that about Sweden, that if you look back at the data of the last 5 to 10 years from Statistica, which is what I've cited, the remaining 1.5 months of the year, they're tracking pretty much towards 90,000 annual deaths. 90,000 plus minus 2,000. That's what I've estimated. You can see it for yourself. So what we're seeing is that we cannot distinguish in the data any additional deaths caused because of any pandemic. And this is about Sweden, the country that did not do lockdowns. Okay, it did not do compulsory things, did all the things like the social distancing and so on. That's all good. No lockdowns, no compulsory mask mandate, no hysteria. That country has seen absolutely no increase in overall deaths over the last 1 year. And it is traveling well towards 90,000 annual deaths. Remember, 90,000 was this madman. I think I should call him madman. Maybe that's the right word for people like Neil Ferguson. That's the kind of numbers they were saying. 95,000 will die only from this damn disease. Not a single extra death over the last 1 year, over the the course of the year. And the reason for that happens is very simple. When there is a little bit of an excess death from a particular flu in a given year, like 2017 was a bit of a bad year for flu, after that flu season, the deaths simply plummet because the flu takes away those elderly people who would have died in the next 3 months or 6 months. So during the course of the year, the number doesn't show up. The average remains the constant, 90,000 or so in Sweden. And we're seeing in India as well, there's virtually only 5 days of extra, deaths, annual deaths, which will simply be not visible. As you look at the annual figure in India of the deaths from this so-called pandemic, you won't find any evidence of a pandemic. So what we've seen here, that's the kind of, the broad structure of my complaint, where I talk about these issues of hysteria, the breaking of the law, the carnage. And this carnage, I argue, and that's the main issue, is that these extra deaths caused by lockdowns can actually be detected using some statistics. And we've got 2 types of case controls. The first is that of Sweden. We can always compare and see how many extra deaths took place in Sweden from cancer or heart attack over the next 1 or 2 years. We can count it. That gives us a rough estimate of what would have occurred on its own. But I don't think there are any extra deaths there. We're just seeing the normal numbers. And I don't think we're going to see extra deaths in the next 1 or 2 years in Sweden either. But in these countries like Australia, in these countries like India, in countries like USA, you're going to start seeing significant increase in cancer deaths and others in the next 1 or 2 years. Those are the kind of things that can be detected using by comparing with Sweden or by comparing with that country's past data. That's a perfectly doable statistical project that I'm sure many people will be attempting in the coming years. Now, each and every of these persons who died before his time and maybe lost maybe 5, 10, 20 years of life was basically manslaughter, murder, I don't know about murder, but manslaughter or some such crime. Because the government cannot take away somebody's life while trying to save another person's life. And as you know, the lives of even in Australia, the Victoria, the number of people who've died, you look at the data, it's only those well above the age of 80, 85. Okay? And these are people who are living beyond the average longevity of this country. They've lost, if we had, let's say, the lockdowns worked beautifully, perfectly, we could save these few people's lives for a few months. We would have saved maybe, a few people's lives by a few months or maybe 1 or 2 years. But we've taken away the lives of tens of thousands, maybe potentially millions across the world, well over, many, many months, many years, potentially 20, 30 years. That is a crime. I've also sort of made the simple argument that's very obvious to everybody. When we send a government, let's say, to fight a bushfire is, a fire in the forest. It's called a bushfire in Australia. So we send a government to go and fight a bushfire that's attacking a particular house. Do we authorize the government to, in the process, go and burn other houses that it finds on the way? To go and burn and to kill other people on the way? I don't think so. There is no authorization for the government to go and cause extra harm while trying to protect somebody else. In this case, the lockdowns, they have caused enormous extra harm, I call carnage. Apart from the mental harms, which are quite enormous and significant, so many people wrote to me, so I've put out there, some of those examples I've given as case studies. You can have a read of the complaint to understand the enormous torture caused by these lockdowns. So what we see here is, a complete breach of all the laws, a complete, a direct attack on the people's human rights, but also on their life and their mental stability and health. And that's actually ongoing. Even in Australia right now, in South Australia, they've started doing these lockdowns. They're not stopping this, okay? And they will not stop it because there's no way they can eradicate the virus. I cannot imagine a more stupid exercise than this in my whole life. I don't think I've ever thought of that human beings can do such a thing. I don't think you would think about anyone doing such a thing if you think for 5 minutes. Have a think about it. Is it even humanly possible for Australia to eradicate the virus? And what are they doing? They're trying to force everyone to stay home or whatever till they inject everybody with a vaccine. But if you can't even identify the pandemic in the data of, say, Sweden, there is no particular crisis going on in the first place. It's only killed a few elderly people. For the vast majority of the people, including in Victoria, I think there was only one person below the age of 50 who died from coronavirus. Okay, this kind of a number, if you look at the distribution, it's so clearly towards the elderly. So these people would have died this year from flu or whatever, and I'll talk about that separately in more detail separately. But there is a lot of conflation going on between flu and COVID. There's a lot of data issues with the reporting of COVID deaths, a massive issue. But I won't go into that. I've just touched upon it in my ICC complaint, but I'll go into it in more detail in a separate conversation. And that is because I'm also preparing a supplementary submission to the ICC. In that supplementary submission, I'm going to provide a lot more detail about these issues, the data issues that I've just alluded to. Also in my complaint, I've highlighted the fear-mongering and the terror and the police state that has been created. And as you see, images from all over the world, police is beating up people who are regular citizens. They beat up in India, Modi, and they just beat up our people, okay? Allegedly to save them. They beat them up. Many, many people were forced to walk home in India for hundreds of miles. They died on the way. That's all part of the kind of torture and hysteria and genocide, you could argue, potentially, crimes against humanity at least, caused by these inhumane lockdowns in India. and a similar, kind of terror, torture, beatings. One person was sent to the ICU in by the police because of police beatings. He had to have induced coma to survive because he just was beaten up so badly by the police. And this has happened all over the world. People are being terrorized by the police. So we're starting to see the use of police for so-called public health purposes. That's completely absurd. Public health, when there's a crisis, let's assume this was a very big pandemic. It's not, but let's assume it was. Then at that point, are you supposed to go and terrorize the people? So this terror, the police state that's been created, I've discussed that as well in the ICC complaint. And in this process, as you go through the complaint, towards the last end of the chapter, I've even raised some matters which are of potential significant concern. I've raised questions. Is there any evidence that it is the money that some people are making in this process from vaccines? Is that driving this thing? Why have so many people lost their head for so long? What is driving them? Do these people have shares in these companies of vaccines or whatever? I've just raised those questions because they have actually given immunity to these vaccine producing companies from any liability. So that means if the vaccine goes and causes you a lot of harm, potentially kills you, these companies are completely free. They're scot-free. They made their profits, but there's no liability. So they're going to be having a fast-track vaccine, the moonshot vaccines or whatever, the very, very fast-track, short-circuiting God knows how many processes, how many animal trials. And in that process, they're going to have vaccine injected into everybody, but giving complete liability exemption to these companies. A lot of money is being made by some people in this process, even as it's being destroyed at an alarming rate. The world's wealth, the world's hard work, production, the poor people, as Martin Kulldorff says, it's the poor who have suffered the most and are going to suffer the most in the coming years, as I've also explained in this complaint. Okay, so this was basically the summary of my complaint. This is my first of my many conversations that I'll have in the coming weeks using my little new studio that I've started here. And I'm hoping to discuss individual topics in more detail in the coming weeks as I understand them better. And I invite people to send me information. But more importantly, please, think about these issues. Think about this. Read my complaint, read my book, read the various articles like Fin Review article and my submission to the Samuel Griffith Society and so on. So have a think about these issues and see what you can do as a person on this planet to stop this hysteria and to get some sanity back into our lives and to get some humanity back into our lives. We've become inhumane as a society. I think we need to change. All right, that's all for now. Thank you very much.